one of the most anticipated horror films of the year, with a massive opening recouping 5 times its budget in its first weekend, and starring a British actor whose work I've loved. This is my review of Get Out. Chris is a young black guy on the way to visit his white girlfriend's parents for the first time. When they get there, things are pretty awkward, not just for racial reasons, but also because everyone's acting kind of weird. Not least the family's black servants, Walter and Georgina, the housekeeper and the groundskeeper. More and more strange things happen to Chris, including him being hypnotised by his girlfriend's mum, until he realises the truth behind what's happening at her house. The most important aspect of Get Out, and one that dominates its runtime, is how it deals with racial politics. One of the things I really liked about it, and something that I've started to see reflected in a lot of films that came out this year from black creators, movies like Moonlight and Hidden Figures, is that the movie doesn't want to have racists in it who are these terrible, monstrous people. Alright, I take it back. Although the characters are monstrous, body-swapping weirdos, they don't view themselves as being racist, and yet they have a set of racist assumptions that the film really spells out. I'll give you an example. When Chris is at the garden party, which is basically a front for being sized up as a possible future body-swapping prospect by these guys, no one ever says they want to be him because he's black. No one ever says that they view him as being less than a person because he's black. But they're constantly talking about what they consider blackness to be. Someone squeezes his arms and says, "Oh wow, you're so strong," you know. People talk about his genetic makeup and what it predisposes him to be. So there, they think they're not being racist because they're being nice to him and they're saying nice things about him, but they're not really saying those things about him. They're talking about stereotypes that have been attached to black people due to their portrayal in the media. Now, the reason why Get Out is so successful in talking about that kind of racism is that it deliberately invites you into a situation where you think everything's going to be fine for the black dude. He shows up to this situation with his really progressive girlfriend. Her mum and dad are educated, progressive, nice people who live in a nice area, and it still goes to shit. And that's where Peele is really subversive, because he's basically saying, you might consider yourself to be the most progressive person in the world. You know, you voted for Obama and you would have voted for him for a third term, and yet you can still very much be part of a systemic racism. What Get Out does, and it does it really well, is put you very firmly in Chris's shoes and put you through a series of acutely observed microaggressions. You can't help but walk out of that movie, I think, with a better understanding of what that would be like to be the only black guy in a room that's full of white people, and then to be isolated by other members of the black community as well. It's a really clever thing that he's done there. By making a horror movie that's basically about racism, he invites you to conflate the two and basically puts racism into a twisty horror structure so that even if you are a systemic racist, you can still watch that and think, so that's what it looks like. That's what I do. That's what it looks like from the outside. After Chris arrives at the house for the first night and her family is kind of okay, but also full of these weird little things, and there's lots of like, hey, you know, I know you're black, but we're cool with it. He's sitting upstairs playing with like his Windows tablet. His girlfriend is just popping in and out of the bathroom, brushing her teeth, being like, I can't believe my dad would say this kind of stuff about you, and I can't believe he'd do this stuff. And it's a really well observed scene that Daniel Kaluuya does a great performance in, because he just sits there going, and what he's saying with that is just like, I told you so. I live through this all the time. This happens everywhere. Even with the most liberal people, I still experience racism. So what he's saying there is that racism is an everyday experience, and that it's not just something that is special and happens in like late night assaults from skinheads. It's part of a lived experience that a lot of black people go through every day when they go to white communities, white friends, white girlfriends' houses. And I think that's a really powerful scene. I'm not sure if I can equate that with an own experience of mine, because of course, you know, I'm not sure if you noticed, but I'm not a black guy. But it makes me think of a conversation I once had with my girlfriend where we were talking about how we can promote women filmmakers. She stopped me and told me how much I interrupted her during the conversation, and I hadn't even realized I was doing it, right? Because I grew up in an environment that is systemically anti-women. I'd never really looked at that issue from an outside perspective. I'd always been like, what can I do about feminism? I'd never really imagined what it was like to live through a systemically misogynist world. And I think that's the great thing about Get Out, is that it is fun for black audiences because it has a really strong sense of humor where it points this stuff out and goes like, right? So for them, they can be like, well, I feel heard. You know, this is a film for a black creator, black actor, black writers, where I feel like my experience is being talked about on screen in a way that it isn't really done almost at all, and certainly not very often. And also it appeals to white audiences because ultimately you learn something. You come out of that movie with a better understanding of what microaggressions are and what you do to make black people's lives more difficult. I always get nervous talking about politics, especially about race. The best thing about the screening that I went to was that it was a really equal split. Young and old people, black, white, Asian, some Latin American people, and men and women in equal splits. And the crazy thing about this movie was that there were loads of laughs throughout. It's a very light movie in some ways. It's very funny, even if it's dealing with really, really problematic stuff. But each different bit of the audience laughed at different points. Black women laughed at a certain point. Black men laughed at another point. The white guys were chuckling away at other stuff. It's fascinating how that works, and it shows you just how skilled Peele can be to deal with such a controversial topic and still have a whole set of people cackling away throughout. Okay, politics out of the way, and I don't mean to belittle them or insinuate that they aren't the most important thing about this movie, but one thing that I feel like might slip out of the debate if we just talk about the race politics of the film is that this is a really well constructed horror, and it's also a very strong comedy in a lot of ways. Jordan Peele is a director who has a very strong background in comedy, and I actually think that comedy and horror are very similar genres in a lot of ways. Fundamentally, horror and comedy are an audience interactive genre, if that makes any sense. They're inviting the audience to do something as a response. Horror, they've got to scream, comedy, they've got to laugh, and what Get Out manages to do really nicely is both. You can see other directors who are really good at that. You think about someone like Sam Raimi, for instance, who knows always where to make an audience laugh in a scene to make the next scare that much more scary. Get Out has some really great nighttime sequences where tension slowly builds. The opening of Get Out is a great example. Andre is walking through these white suburbs, these rich suburbs that he's in, and a little car pulls up next to him. You can hear the run, rabbit, run, run, and already you get this sort of tense, kind of like slowly building horror. The way that the camera spins around Andre, the way that it blocks to hide where the possible killer might be, is a really clever bit of horror. It builds tension really slowly and kind of dreadfully. So when it finally happens, when he's assaulted, it's shocking, but it's also a release of something that's built up, and that makes it all the more disturbing and scary. And then Get Out follows it with about half an hour of comedy. And in fact, it's got some horror elements there, like the groundskeeper and the housekeeper who are really weird and kind of scary and Stepfordy. They're the only other black people on the estate, and they stare at Chris the whole time, and it's really uncomfortable. And it could have been like a normal horror beat that kind of would have been a bit hackneyed and silly if they'd done it as horror. So Peele instead kind of over-eggs the cake and turns it into a comedy moment, so you're laughing away with it. And later on, when you find out the truth about those characters, that makes those sections of the film retroactively horrible, which I think is a really clever thing to do. I can't describe every scene, but basically almost every scene has something like that in it, where it has a tension between something that's really funny and something that's really horrible. Part of that is because Daniel Kaluuya has really good experience working on stuff that is really, really dark. If you think about his role in Sicario, he is essentially the comic relief in that film, even though it is so horrible and without relief, really, as a movie. So he knows kind of where to weight comedy and where to weight the horror. I think the directing in this film is the best thing about it. There's a couple of bits that I didn't like. There's some stuff like, there's like scare chords and a couple of Dutch angles and stuff that just throw stuff off. And that, more than anything, feels like the influence of Blumhouse. They make really generic horrors quite often, and I think that this movie just isn't that. Someone in the edit suite being like, put a scare chord in there. Oh, there you go. Now the 14-year-olds will know it's scary. I think I gushed about the movie enough. I think you should just go and see it. Pay to go and see it, watch it in a cinema, watch it a couple of times, bring your mates. It's a film that's worth supporting, and we need more movies like it. And I want to round this off by asking for suggestions and ideas. When I was watching this, I was trying to think about other horror movies I'd seen with black protagonists. The one movie that I did think of when I was watching this was The People Under the Stairs, the movie by Wes Craven. And that really struck me as being quite similar. It's a horror that's very funny, it's about strongly social issues, and it's about race. It's also one of literally the 3 horror movies with black protagonists that I can think of. If you have a suggestion for a horror film that has a black protagonist and/or a black director or writer, please let me know in the comments down below. Anyway, that's it from me. Go and check out Get Out. It's in the cinemas now, and it is definitely worth your time and effort. Thanks so much for watching. Have a good one, and I'll see you later.